1 second. Exactly that much time was needed to turn a healthy man into a living corpse. The blue flash that he saw was brighter than the sun, and the dose of radiation piercing his body equaled the epicenter of the explosion in Hiroshima. But the scariest thing is not that he died. The scariest thing is that he was not allowed to die. This is a chronicle of the cruelest experiment in the history of medicine, where a human was turned into a laboratory specimen. You are on the Raccoon Chronicles channel, and today we will look into real hell. Let's go. September 30th, 1999. Ibaraki Prefecture, the small town of Tokaimura, which is called the atomic heart of Japan, because a huge part of the country's nuclear industry is concentrated here, and local residents are used to the sight of reactors and pipes, considering them absolutely safe neighbors. On that day, at 10 in the morning, 3 workers entered the fuel conversion workshop of the JCO company to perform a seemingly routine task of uranium purification. But they did not know that the management of their company had already signed their death warrant for the sake of saving time and money. Let's break down who these people are. 35-year-old Hisashi Ouchi, 40-year-old Masato Shinohara, and their boss, 54-year-old Yutaka Yokokawa. And it is important to understand that none of them was a nuclear physicist. They were simple hard workers who did not understand the deep processes of nuclear reaction. They simply followed the instructions that were given to them from above. The task was as follows. They needed to prepare fuel for the experimental breeder reactor Joyo, and this was not an ordinary order, because this reactor required uranium with a much higher degree of enrichment, 18 8/10%, while for ordinary NPPs only 3 to 5% is used. And this is a critically important detail, because the higher the enrichment, the more unstable the material, and the easier it is to start a chain reaction. According to official, state-approved safety rules, the process of dissolving uranium oxide powder in nitric acid must take place in a special tall column with narrow geometry, which physically does not allow uranium to accumulate in one place in an amount sufficient for critical mass. And this process must be automated so that people do not contact the solution directly. But the JCO company had burning deadlines. They were behind schedule, and management decided that the official procedure was too long and tedious. Therefore, bypassing all laws and common sense, they wrote their own illegal instruction, which the workers called the URA manual, and this document allowed workers to mix uranium manually, as if they were cooking soup in the kitchen, using ordinary stainless steel buckets. Just think about this level of madness. At a nuclear facility at the end of the 20th century, people scoop deadly radioactive solution with mugs and pour it with buckets, completely ignoring physics. Hisashi Ouchi and Masato Shinohara started their shift early in the morning. They took uranium powder and began dissolving it in nitric acid directly in 10-liter stainless steel buckets, stirring this hellish mixture manually to speed up the reaction. Their boss Yokokawa sat at a table in the next room, literally a few meters away from them, controlling the process according to documents. According to their internal criminal instruction, they were supposed to pour this solution into a thick-walled precipitation tank, which was equipped with a water-cooling jacket. And here lies the main, fatal error of design and planning. This tank had a wide, squat shape. It looked like a large pot, and not like a narrow pipe. And its geometry was ideally suited to collect a critical mass of uranium in one point. The workers did not know what critical mass was. No one explained this to them at the proper level. They thought that uranium was just a dangerous chemical, like poisonous acid, and if it didn't spill on the skin, then everything was fine. By 10:35 in the morning, they had already poured 4 buckets of uranium solution into this tank, and everything was going normally. But they needed to pour 7 buckets there to finish the batch. Hisashi Ouchi stood on a stepladder, holding onto the edge of the tank with one hand, and holding a large glass funnel inserted into the tank opening with the other, while Masato Shinohara stood on the floor and lifted a bucket, carefully so as not to splash, pouring the 7th, last portion of enriched uranium directly into the funnel. At this very moment, when the last stream of liquid touched the surface of the solution in the tank, the total amount of uranium in the container reached 16 kilograms, which exceeded the safe mass limit for a container of such shape several times. Inside the tank, instantly, in fractions of a nanosecond, a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction began. Uranium atoms began to split, ejecting neutrons that hit neighboring atoms, causing their splitting, and this process became avalanche-like. The first thing they noticed was not the sound of an explosion, because a nuclear explosion in the cinematic sense did not happen. There was no mushroom cloud or shockwave. Instead, the room was flooded by a blinding, unnatural blue flash. This was Cherenkov radiation, arising when charged particles move in the air faster than light moves in the same medium. At the same second, the gamma radiation sensor went off, howling like a wounded animal, and the workers instinctively understood that something terrible had happened. But they didn't even have time to get scared before a stream of neutron radiation of monstrous power passed through their bodies. Hisashi Ouchi, who hung directly over the tank holding the funnel, took the most powerful hit, effectively looking into the face of a working reactor. He was at a distance of only 40 centimeters from the epicenter of the reaction. Masato Shinohara was a bit further, a meter away, and Yokokawa was behind a thin wall 4 meters away. At this instant, trillions of neutrons flew through Ouchi's body, and this is not just radiation. These are heavy particles that act like microscopic cannonballs. They do not simply pass through tissues. They crash into cell nuclei, tear chromosomes, knock atoms out of molecules, turning the very structure of the human body into a sieve at the atomic level. Ouchi and Shinohara recoiled from the tank in horror, dropping buckets in the funnel, and rushed to run out of the room, screaming that they saw a blue light. They ran out into the corridor, then into the decontamination room, tearing off their clothes. But this was absolutely pointless, because the radiation was not on the clothes. It was already inside them. It passed through them like a knife through butter. Immediately after the flash, Ouchi felt a sharp attack of nausea. He vomited right in the corridor. He began to lose consciousness. This was an instant reaction of the nervous system to the massive destruction of cells. It is important to understand the scale. The lethal dose for a human is about 7 sieverts, and even at such a dose, death occurs in a couple of weeks in agony. But Hisashi Ouchi, in that fraction of a second, received a dose of 17, and according to some data, even 20 sieverts, which is an absolute prohibitive record in the history of the peaceful atom. This is approximately the same as if he stood in the center of the explosion in Hiroshima, but at the same time remained physically intact on the outside. Arriving rescuers, dressed in protective suits, found Ouchi lying on a stretcher. He was conscious, but looked strange. His skin, especially on his face and right hand, with which he held the funnel, became frighteningly red, filled with blood, as if he had been badly sunburned in 1 second, and he complained of severe pain in his hand and ears. Shinohara was also conscious, but looked a little better, although his face also began to darken before the eyes, acquiring an earthy shade. None of the ambulance doctors who took them to the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba City understood the real scale of the disaster. They thought they were dealing with a normal radiation burn or slight overexposure, because the patients spoke, answered questions, and were coherent. Ouchi himself, lying in the ambulance, thought that he simply felt bad from the chemicals. He worried that he had caused problems for the company, and hoped that they would treat him in a couple of days, and he would return home to his wife and little son. He did not know that at the moment when he saw the blue light, his DNA, the instruction by which his body is built and renewed, was completely destroyed, erased like data from a hard drive by a powerful magnet. His cells could no longer divide. They did not know how to regenerate. And in fact, he was already a walking corpse whose body began to slowly but irreversibly fall apart into component parts right in real time. When Ouchi was delivered to the specialized hospital, the doctors were in confusion. Before them lay a young, strong man who looked almost healthy. He did not have 4th-degree burns. There were no holes in his body. He talked and even tried to joke. But when they took the first blood test and looked into the microscope, the lab technicians experienced a real shock that made their hair stand on end. Leukocytes were completely absent in Ouchi's blood, the very immune cells that protect us from bacteria. Their number was equal to 0. But the scariest thing was in something else. When geneticists tried to find his chromosomes to assess the damage, they found nothing but chaotic debris. Hisashi Ouchi's chromosomes were literally blown up, torn to shreds, and putting them back together was just as impossible as putting back together a glass vase smashed into dust. The doctors understood that before them was a medical phenomenon, and simultaneously a doomed man who had no future. But the system, pressure from authorities, and the desire to study a unique case did not allow them to let him leave peacefully. Thus began the cruelest, most unethical, and longest medical experiment on maintaining life in a body that had already died. October 1st, 1999, just 24 hours after that fatal blue flash, Hisashi Ouchi is transferred to the University of Tokyo Hospital because doctors at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences quickly realized that their competence and equipment would simply not be enough to save this patient. At this moment begins the most insidious and cruel stage of radiation sickness, which medics call the walking ghost phase. And this is exactly the state that misleads both the victim himself and his relatives, giving them false, treacherous hope. Ouchi lies in a sterile room. He looks tired. His face is slightly swollen and reddened, as if he had too much alcohol or over-tanned on the beach. His right hand, which was closest to the funnel, hurts and has swollen like a rubber glove. But he is fully conscious. He talks to nurses. He asks to turn on the TV, and even discusses his discharge plans with doctors. He does not feel how inside him, in complete silence, massive cell extinction is happening, because radiation is an invisible killer that first attacks those body systems where cells divide fastest. First of all, the bone marrow came under attack, the main blood factory in our body, which every second must produce millions of new erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. But the neutron hit completely destroyed the progenitor stem cells, turning the bone marrow into a lifeless desert. When doctors took his blood for analysis in Tokyo, they saw that the level of lymphocytes, the main defenders of the organism against infections, dropped practically to zero, and this meant that Ouchi became absolutely defenseless against any, even the most harmless bacteria living on his skin or in his intestine. For a normal person, a scratch is a trifle. For Ouchi now, it is a death sentence, because there is no one to fight the microbes, and that is exactly why he was placed in a special hermetic capsule with laminar airflow, where absolute sterility was maintained, and all medical staff entered to him only in full biological protection suits, resembling spacesuits. But the scariest moment, which forever changed the attitude of doctors to this case, happened when geneticists led by Professor Mikawa decided to look at the patient's karyotype to assess the scale of DNA damage. Normally, human chromosomes under a microscope look like neat pairs, similar to the letter X, ordered and clear. This is the instruction for the assembly and repair of our body. But what the doctors saw in Ouchi's samples made them shudder with horror. There were no chromosomes. Instead of clear structures, they saw a chaotic mess, scattered black dots and scraps, as if someone took a glass vase and smashed it against the wall with full force. The genetic code of Hisashi Ouchi, the very program that tells the cell how to live, how to divide, and how to repair tissues, was physically destroyed by the neutron bombardment. This meant that his body could no longer create new cells to replace the old ones, and as soon as the old cells die naturally, there will be nothing to replace them with, and he will start falling apart alive. At this moment, a difficult ethical and medical question arose before the Council of Doctors. Is it worth continuing treatment if science says there are no chances, or should they simply anesthetize him and let him go? But two factors worked here. Firstly, Japanese culture and medical ethics of that time did not allow simply giving up while the patient's heart is beating. And secondly, Ouchi's family, his wife, parents, and sister, begged the doctors to do everything possible. They clung to the fact that he was conscious and talking. They did not believe that this ruddy man was already dead. Professor Mikawa and his team decided to take an unprecedented risk and try to restore the patient's destroyed immune system using the newest method at that time: peripheral blood stem cell transplantation. After all, if blood production is restarted, the body will have a chance to fight infections, and perhaps this will give time for the healing of other tissues. Hisashi's own sister agreed to become a donor, whose HLA compatibility indicators matched perfectly, and it was an act of desperate love and self-sacrifice, because the cell collection procedure is painful and difficult, but she was ready for anything. On the 6th and 7th of October, in the first week after the accident, doctors performed the transplantation, introducing the sister's cells into Ouchi's veins, hoping that they would find their way into the empty bone marrow and start engrafting there. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the results, because this was the first case in the world of cell transplantation to a patient with such a colossal dose of neutron irradiation. But while doctors waited for the sprouts of new blood, radiation continued its destructive work in other organs, and the gastrointestinal tract became the next victim. The mucous membrane of our intestine renews completely every 3 to 4 days. This is a very fast process, and that is exactly why radiation hits it so hard. Old cells began to die off and peel away, and new ones due to destroyed chromosomes did not appear. Hisashi began to experience unbearable constant thirst. He drank water by the liter, but it was not absorbed because the absorbing surface of the intestine was disappearing, turning into one continuous bleeding wound. Severe diarrhea began. He lost liters of fluid per day. Blood and mucus came out of him, and doctors were forced to connect him to a central vein to infuse nutrient solutions and water directly into the blood, as his digestive system effectively shut down. But the most nightmarish visual manifestation of the decay became his skin. At first, doctors noticed that ordinary medical tape used to secure catheters left marks when removed, but very soon it became clear that the skin itself was coming off along with the tape. The epidermis, the upper protective layer, stopped renewing. The bonds between skin layers broke down, and it began to simply slide off the meat like wet paper. Any touch, any turning of the patient on the sheet caused him infernal pain and left open wounds through which lymph and blood oozed. Ouchi, who was still conscious, saw how his body was betraying him. He saw his skin remaining on the bandages. He felt how his mouth and throat were covered with ulcers, making it difficult to speak and swallow. Doctors began pumping him with powerful painkillers, switching to medical narcotics, but even they could not completely drown out the pain from the total detachment of the skin. By the 10th day, he could no longer breathe normally due to pulmonary edema, as fluid accumulated in the pleural cavity, and doctors had to intubate him, inserting a tube into the trachea, and connect him to a mechanical ventilator. This was the moment when Hisashi Ouchi lost the ability to speak, and his communication with the world was reduced to writing short notes with the trembling hand on a tablet, while he could still hold a pen. It was during this period, when doctors were performing another painful procedure to treat his body, which had turned into a continuous burn, that he wrote those very terrible words that became the symbol of this tragedy. "I can't take it anymore," and then added, "I am not a guinea pig." This was a cry of despair from a man who realized that his salvation had turned into sophisticated torture, but the machine of modern medicine had already gained momentum and could not stop. Doctors interpreted these words as temporary weakness and depression. They invited a psychiatrist. But what could a psychiatrist say to a man who is rotting alive? The family, seeing his suffering through the glass of the sterile box, continued to hope for a miracle, and doctors continued to pour liters of antibiotics, blood, and nutrient mixtures into him, trying to plug holes in a ship that had long since gone to the bottom. On the 18th day came news that for a brief moment illuminated everyone with hope. Tests showed that the sister's cells had engrafted. New, healthy leukocytes began to appear in Ouchi's blood. The bone marrow started working. The doctors rejoiced. It seemed like an incredible success, proof that they were right in choosing aggressive treatment. It seemed that here it was, the turning point. Now that there is immunity, the body will start to cope. But the joy was short-lived and was replaced by even deeper horror when a few days later, new tests showed something that did not fit in the head. The healthy chromosomes transplanted from the sister, having entered Ouchi's body, also began to mutate and break down. It turned out that Hisashi's body itself had become a source of secondary radiation. The very neutrons that pierced him during the accident activated sodium in his blood and bones, turning him into a radioactive emitter. His body became a toxic reactor that killed the very saving cells that were supposed to cure him. The sister's cells, falling into this radioactive hell, died just like his own. This was the end of hope for recovery, but not the end of torment, because Ouchi's heart was young and strong, and it continued to beat, driving poisoned blood through a dying body, forcing his brain, locked in the cranial box, to realize what was happening until doctors made the decision to put him into a medically induced coma to relieve inhuman pain, turning him into a biological object whose life was supported only by blinking lights of devices and humming pumps. Doctors fell into the trap of their own responsibility. They had already gone so far that retreating seemed like a crime, and continuing like sadism. But the system demanded to fight until the last second, recording every step of decay, every milliliter of administered medicine, turning the intensive care unit into a testing ground for collecting unique data on how much a human can withstand who has been deprived of the right to die. By the beginning of November 1999, the intensive care unit finally turned into a high-tech torture chamber where doctors, led by scientific interest and strict Japanese laws, artificially prolonged the process of human decay. After the failure with the sister's cell transplant, medics faced a problem from horror movies. They were trying to save the life of a patient who was missing the largest organ, the skin. We are used to considering skin just a shell, but for the organism, it is a hermetic spacesuit, and this spacesuit Hisashi Ouchi no longer had. Medical staff discovered with horror that ordinary tape, used to secure catheters, now came off along with pieces of meat because radiation destroyed the basal layer of the epidermis, and there was nothing left to hold the tissues together. Ouchi experienced pain of such force that it was impossible to drown out, because his nerve endings were exposed and in contact with the air, so he was put on fentanyl, which is 100 times more powerful than morphine, but even in a narcotic fog, his body shuddered. It was during this period, gathering the last remnants of will, that he wrote crooked hieroglyphs on a piece of paper, which became the verdict of the entire operation. I can't take it anymore. I am not a guinea pig. This was a direct demand to stop the torment, but the doctors ignored the plea. Why? There was no malicious intent here. Bureaucracy worked. According to Japanese laws, doctors did not have the right to disconnect a patient while his heart was beating independently, and Ouchi's heart was incredibly strong. So that he would stop resisting, he was simply put into a deep medically induced coma, depriving him of the right to vote. Now the main problem became fluid loss through the absence of skin and destroyed intestine. Up to 20 liters of plasma and blood flowed out of the body per day. Imagine 10 2-liter bottles pouring out of a person daily, turning the bed into a swamp. To compensate for this, solutions were continuously poured into him, but due to disturbed metabolism, the fluid was not retained in the vessels and went into the tissues, due to which Ouchi swelled monstrously, turning into a bloated, faceless mass. In an attempt to close the wounds, doctors decided on an experiment with artificially grown skin in the laboratory. It was a most complex operation where they, centimeter by centimeter, applied flaps to the muscles. But physiology cannot be fooled. For skin to graft, capillaries are needed, and Ouchi's vessels were burned. So the transplanted skin simply rotted right on him, turning into a wet rag under which pus accumulated. Simultaneously with this, the respiratory system began to fail, the lungs filled with fluid, and the ventilator pushed air through with difficulty. But the worst nightmare was happening in the intestine. Its mucous membrane completely disappeared, turning the guts into a bleeding pipe. Unceasing diarrhea began, through which he lost liters of blood, and doctors had to do transfusions on an industrial scale, effectively completely changing all the blood in his body every 24 hours. The heart worked to exhaustion, pumping foreign blood with a pulse of 140 beats per minute, as if he ran a marathon while lying in a coma. By the end of November, Ouchi's appearance changed so much that his wife and parents barely recognized him. His eyelids stopped closing due to drying and skin tension, so doctors taped his eyes shut, and bloody tears flowed from the corners as the mucous membranes also dissolved. Bacteria living in the hospital quickly developed immunity to antibiotics and began to devour his muscles, causing chronic sepsis. Kidneys failed, clogged with toxins from the breakdown of his own muscles. The liver stopped working, and in fact, Hisashi Ouchi became simply a set of rotting tissues held together only by bandages and the work of a dozen machines. Doctors understood that they had lost, but the inertia of the rescue machine was so powerful that no one dared to press the stop button. On November 27th, on the 59th day of this medical nightmare, an event occurred in the intensive care unit that forever divided the history of Hisashi Ouchi's treatment into before and after. His heart, this incredible biological pump that for almost 2 months pumped foreign blood in huge doses of chemicals, suddenly stopped. At this moment, time in the sterile box froze, devices howled with an alarming squeak, and the doctors faced the most important moral choice of all this time. If this were an ordinary patient with terminal cancer, they would most likely have let him go. But Ouchi was patient number 1, a symbol of Japanese medicine's fight against radiation, and the inertia of rescue was too great. The resuscitation team led by Professor Mekawa immediately began heart massage and adrenaline administration. Time after time, they launched a defibrillator discharge into his mutilated chest, risking breaking fragile ribs. This lasted a whole hour, an hour during which his brain and organs experienced severe hypoxia. But in the end, they managed to perform a miracle that many would call a curse. Ouchi's heart beat again. However, this was a Pyrrhic victory, because the cardiac arrest dealt a fatal finishing blow to those few body systems that were still somehow functioning. Due to lack of oxygen, his brain, kidneys, and liver received irreversible damage, and now he finally ceased to be a human capable of recovery, turning into a purely biological object, life in which was supported exclusively by external forces. After this incident, even Ouchi's family, who all this time begged doctors to do everything possible and believed in a miracle, broke down. Seeing how their son and husband were literally forcibly dragged back from the other world only so that he would continue to rot, they signed a document that should have been signed a month ago, a do not resuscitate order in case of repeated cardiac arrest, the so-called DNR protocol, do not resuscitate. From this moment, the doctor's strategy changed. They stopped trying to cure him because there was nothing to cure, and switched to the tactic of simply maintaining indicators on monitors, effectively observing how long a human body can exist without DNA. December 99 became the final act of this tragedy. While the whole world was preparing to meet the millennium, buying champagne and waiting for the onset of a new era, in a hermetic ward of the University of Tokyo Hospital, one man was slowly disintegrating into atoms. His condition worsened with every hour. Necrosis, that is, tissue death, spread from muscles to internal organs. His body turned black in places, as tissue simply died from lack of nutrition and toxic shock. The immune system was completely absent, and colonies of bacteria resistant to all existing antibiotics raged in his blood. They devoured him from the inside, releasing toxins that poisoned the brain. Doctors were forced to administer vasopressors, drugs that artificially constrict blood vessels and increase blood pressure. Because his own pressure constantly fell to critical levels, his vessels lost tone and became like leaky hoses. Every day they continued to transfuse blood, but it was like pouring gasoline into a car that has no bottom. December 21st arrived, the 83rd day after the accident. On the morning of that day, the doctor on duty noticed a sharp, catastrophic drop in blood pressure that did not respond even to maximum doses of stimulants. This was a signal that multiple organ failure had set in, a condition where all life support systems shut down simultaneously, like dominoes. Ouchi's heart began to slow down. His rhythm became chaotic. Long pauses between beats appeared on the monitor. Hisashi's wife and parents entered the ward. They were dressed in protective suits so that they could stand for the last time next to what remained of their loved one. Doctors, remembering the signed agreement, stepped away from the bed and turned off the alarm signals on the devices so that they would not disturb the silence of the last minutes. There was no fuss, no defibrillators and adrenaline injections, only the quiet hum of ventilation and the rare squeak of the heart monitor, which became rarer and rarer. At 11:21 in the evening, a solid flatline appeared on the screen. Hisashi Ouchi, the man who survived the most powerful neutron bombardment in history and 83 days of medical hell, finally died, receiving that liberation he begged for a month and a half ago. But the story did not end there, because Ouchi's death opened a Pandora's box with questions that society had to answer. Immediately after the pronouncement of death, the body was sent for autopsy, and the results of this autopsy shocked even seasoned pathologists. All body muscles turned into a liquid reddish substance. They literally dissolved. The intestines were smooth like plastic tubes, devoid of villi, and the bone marrow was absolutely empty, like a scorched desert. This case became a cruel lesson for the whole world, showing what radiation does to human biology, and proving that no technology, no stem cells, and no money can save an organism whose genetic instruction has been erased. But what happened to the other participants in this drama, who are often forgotten? Masato Shinohara, the second worker, who stood a meter away from the tank and received a dose of 10 sieverts, also went through his personal hell. His agony lasted even longer, 7 months. At first it seemed that he had a chance, but radiation slowly killed his lungs and kidneys, and he died in April 2000 from respiratory failure, becoming the second victim of human negligence. And the third participant, Boss Yutaka Yokokawa, who sat in the next room and gave orders, survived. He received a minor dose, underwent treatment, and was discharged. At the trial that took place later, the JCO company admitted its guilt in violating all conceivable safety norms and paid $121 million in compensation to affected residents and workers' families. But no one from top management went to prison for murder. Yokokawa and 5 other employees received suspended sentences for professional negligence, which caused a storm of indignation in Japanese society. The death of Hisashi Ouchi left us a heavy legacy. It forced a review of international protocols for treating radiation sickness. Was this treatment an act of humanism, or a cruel experiment for the sake of collecting scientific data? There is no answer to this question to this day, but the note, "I am not a guinea pig," will forever remain a silent reproach to the system that put protocol above humanity. The folder is closed. Subscribe to the Raccoon archive. Here we remember those whom the system wanted to forget.